Have you ever, like, watched someone do something and just been totally blown away by their skill?
You mean like someone who's not just competent, but they're like at a whole other level? Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what is that gap? What takes someone from, just getting by to being a true master? It doesn't even have to be anything, like, super complicated. It could be something as simple as, I don't know, woodworking or cooking.
Oh, totally. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. So today, we're going to dive deep into that very question.
Mhm.
How will we go from novice to master?
And we're going to use a pretty cool analogy to explore this. Learning to fly an airplane.
Right. Because when you first start out,
Yeah.
you're consciously managing every single thing, right?
Yeah.
But eventually, with enough practice, it just becomes second nature.
Like you don't even have to think about it.
Right. So that evolution, those distinct phases you go through as you're building expertise, that's what we're going to break down today. And the insights for this deep dive come from a book called Master Airline Pilot, Applying Human Factors to Reach Peak Performance and Operational Resilience.
Now, even if you're thinking, I have zero interest in flying, stick with us. Because the cool thing is, these principles about how we learn and master complex skills, they're surprisingly universal.
Yeah, they apply to pretty much anything you might be learning.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to understand these different stages of pilot development. And we're going to start with that initial feeling of being totally overwhelmed as a novice and work our way all the way up to what the book calls masterclass.
We'll look at how your actual abilities develop, how your mindset shifts, and how you start to develop those mental shortcuts, those what the book calls heuristics.
Right. And ultimately, we want you to walk away from this deep dive with a clearer understanding of your own learning process, no matter what you're currently tackling.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's imagine for a second that you're a qualified pilot. You've been flying for years, maybe even decades.
Right.
And now you're stepping into the cockpit of a major commercial airliner
Yeah.
for the first time.
Okay.
Suddenly, it feels like you're starting all over again. Why?
Well, the source talks about this as information overload, right? And it makes sense. Even though you have all this existing knowledge, you're suddenly bombarded with a massive amount of new information.
Right. It's like drinking from a fire hose.
Totally. It's all those new procedures and regulations, and then you have to learn the specific characteristics of this new, much more complex aircraft.
Yeah. And your brain is trying to process it all as equally important.
Which can be really, really overwhelming.
Totally. And the book says this can lead to some interesting behaviors.
Oh, yeah.
Like novice pilots often overcorrect or undercorrect when they're controlling the aircraft. They also tend to get tunnel vision. They're so focused on one thing that they miss other critical information.
Right. And of course, mistakes are going to happen. It's part of the learning process.
Absolutely. But here's the thing that I found so fascinating.
Yeah.
Despite all that initial struggle, the source actually says that this novice phase is when you see the most rapid improvement.
Oh, that's interesting. Because you would think with all those mistakes and all that frustration that it would be, slower going.
Right. But because you're constantly practicing, you're essentially laying down those foundational neural pathways.
Makes sense. You're taking what you already know and trying to apply it in this new, much more complex environment. So those connections are really getting solidified.
Right. It's like building a house. You have to start with a strong foundation before you can build the rest of the structure.
Yeah, good analogy.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get super specific here. Let's say you're a novice pilot and you need to start the engine.
Okay.
How do you approach that task?
Well, I would imagine at that stage, it's all about following the checklist. It feels like a very rigid sequence of steps where each step is equally critical and has to be performed in order.
Right. And the book really emphasizes this tendency to overprocess information at this stage.
Yeah.
You're using a lot of mental energy on each individual action.
So it's not just like flip a switch and you're good to go.
Not even close. You're consciously having to think through each and everything. And if something unexpected happens...
Oh, that could be a problem.
Right. It can totally throw you off.
The book uses this analogy of driving in an unfamiliar country, which I think is really, really good.
Yeah, I love that one.
Because, you're so focused on staying in your lane and reading every single road sign, right?
Yeah, right.
That you completely miss the overall flow of traffic.
Yeah, or that car that's about to merge into your lane.
Exactly.
Okay, so with time and practice, the novice starts to get more comfortable. They transition into what the source calls the proficient pilot.
Okay.
So what's the key difference here?
Well, things start to become smoother, more fluid.
Okay.
Like tasks that once felt super demanding, now they're routine, they even feel easy, and that constant stream of sensory information that was just overwhelming before,
Yeah.
now they can process it much more efficiently.
It's like their brains have built dedicated pathways for all these common tasks.
Yeah. And they've started to develop those mental shortcuts we talked about earlier, the heuristics.
Right. And the book talks about how proficient pilots start to recognize large blocks of information by matching them to familiar patterns. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. Imagine you're being cleared for a visual approach to land.
Okay.
But a proficient pilot doesn't see that as a bunch of separate, unrelated actions.
Right.
Like, okay, first, I need to manage the aircraft's energy. Then I need to maintain the correct spacing behind the plane in front of me. Then I need to make the turn to line up with the runway. They see it as one integrated sequence.
Right. And within each of those subtasks, there are all these embedded decisions they're making, right?
Yeah, they're thinking about the aircraft's weight, the appropriate speed, what the plane ahead of them is doing, the weather conditions, all those things. And a novice would see all those as separate tasks to think through.
Wow. So the proficient pilot is seeing the whole picture. They're not getting bogged down in all the little details.
Exactly. And this leads to something pretty incredible. The development of subconscious pattern recognition and decision-making.
Okay, that sounds a little bit scary.
I know, right? But it's actually a good thing. The book quotes a proficient pilot as saying, I know where the aircraft needs to be, and I just fly it there. So it's almost like their body and mind are just acting intuitively.
That's a pretty big leap from the novice who's consciously thinking about every tiny adjustment.
Huge difference. And visualization becomes a really powerful tool at this stage. Because they've built this strong mental model of how things should look and feel, they can start to anticipate what's going to happen next. And that frees up their attention to monitor more subtle cues, to expand their situational awareness.
Right. So they're not just reacting to what's happening right now. They're almost predicting what's going to happen next.
Exactly.
And with this increased comfort and familiarity, they start to develop habits and routines.
Yeah, the source talks about the brain on autopilot. It's a great analogy because these common tasks become so ingrained that they can do them without really having to think about it.
Okay, so on the one hand, that sounds amazing.
Right.
But the book also hints at a potential downside to all this.
Okay, what's that?
This idea of settling into a comfort zone.
Right.
What's the risk there?
Well, the big thing is that you start to develop this expectation of normalcy. Like, you subconsciously expect every flight, every procedure to unfold just as it has countless times before.
Okay.
And this can make you less receptive to those unexpected situations.
Interesting.
And the book makes a really important point here. It says that proficiency doesn't necessarily equal peak skill.
So you can be a very competent pilot, but still be operating in that proficient state.
Exactly. And a lot of pilots are perfectly content to stay there.
Right, because it feels good to be competent to have mastered those basic skills.
Totally. So to kind of illustrate this, let's go back to our engine start example. How does a proficient pilot's approach to that task change?
Yeah, what happened to their heuristic?
Well, it goes from that really rigid, step-by-step checklist mentality to a much more fluid, continuous process.
Okay.
The steps kind of blend together. The source calls these mini flows, and they develop this internal sense of pacing, an intuitive feel for how long each subtask should take.
So it's less about checking off boxes and more about a natural progression.
Exactly.
Can you give us some specific examples from the book of how this looks?
Sure. Instead of just checking, bleed air pressure, the proficient pilot is going to do a quick mini flow to make sure the whole air system is configured correctly before they even start the engine.
Oh, yeah.
They're not just looking for a pressure drop when they engage the starter.
Right.
They're verifying that the start valve opened and that the engine is actually rotating.
Wow.
And then the focus shifts from those simple yes-no checks to these more qualitative assessments.
So instead of, is the oil pressure there, they're asking.
Is the oil pressure coming up normally? They're listening to the engine, feeling for vibrations. It's a much more holistic understanding.
Okay, so we've gone from the overwhelmed novice to the competent, comfortable, proficient pilot. Now, let's talk about the master class. What sets these pilots apart?
This is where it gets really interesting.
I'm ready.
Masterclass pilots are those who don't just settle for that comfortable proficiency. They have this drive to continuously push beyond their comfort zone.
It almost sounds like they're never satisfied.
In a way, yeah.
Okay.
They're always looking to expand their knowledge, not just of the technical stuff, but also of the underlying principles. They're really interested in how things work, and they're also constantly trying to improve their own performance.
So it sounds like this requires a lot of conscious effort. It doesn't just happen automatically.
No, absolutely not. The source talks about sustained effort, mindfulness, constantly seeking out new knowledge, and then, this is really important, they also engage in a lot of self-reflection. They're not just content with getting the job done, they want to understand why things happened the way they did.
So even after a perfectly executed landing,
They're still asking themselves, why? How could I have done that even better?
wow, that's impressive.
It is, and the book outlines 3 main benefits to pursuing this level of expertise.
Lay them on me.
Okay, first, they're much better equipped to handle those unexpected, complex situations
That makes sense.
because they have this deeper understanding of the systems and the principles.
Right.
Second, they become amazing instructors and mentors.
Because they've really thought about their own techniques and have all these insights to share.
Exactly. And finally, there's a huge sense of self-satisfaction because they're constantly learning and growing. Every flight, every procedure feels fresh and engaging.
It's like that pursuit of knowledge keeps them motivated.
Totally. And it prevents that complacency that you sometimes see at the proficient level.
Right. So even when they're doing these routine tasks, they're still maintaining a high level of vigilance.
Oh, absolutely. Every engine start, every landing, it's not just another routine item on a checklist. They're always on the lookout for any anomalies.
They're not expecting something to go wrong, but they're ready if it does.
Exactly.
That's a pretty big difference from the proficient pilot who's just expecting things to go smoothly.
Huge. And to really illustrate this difference, let's go back to that engine start example.
Okay.
A proficient pilot might be able to list a few of the more common ways an engine start could fail.
Right, like a start switch malfunction or a problem with the ignition.
Exactly. But a masterclass pilot could give you a much more comprehensive list.
Like what?
Well, they'd include those standard things, but they'd also factor in things like extreme temperatures, high altitude, problems with the external power unit, even a strong tailwind.
Okay.
They're thinking about all the different
They're
variables.
seeing the big picture.
And they could probably even tell you specific stories about each of those potential problems. They might have experienced it themselves or read about it or heard it from another pilot. Their understanding is so much deeper.
The book has this really cool analogy to describe this. It talks about weaving.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Can you walk us through that?
Sure. So the novice pilot's understanding is like a simple crossweave. It's basic and functional, but it's not very complex.
Okay.
The proficient pilot's understanding is like a sturdy canvas. It can handle more stress.
Right.
But the masterclass pilot's understanding is like this really intricate tapestry. There are all these different threads, different colors, different textures, and each thread represents a different experience, a different piece of knowledge. It's all woven together.
That's such a beautiful image.
Yeah.
And it really helps us understand how complex their understanding is.
Yeah, it's a really good visual.
Okay, now the source also talks about heuristics and how they evolve as we move through these different stages of expertise. So can you remind us what heuristics are and how they work?
Yeah, so heuristics are those mental techniques we develop over time. They're kind of like rules of thumb.
Okay.
They help us quickly detect important information, make sense of what it means, and then apply the appropriate procedures.
Right.
So for a novice, those heuristics are very rule-based. It's all about following checklists and procedures.
Okay.
As they gain experience and move into that proficient stage, their heuristics become more fluid, more integrated, like we talked about with the engine start example.
Right, those steps blend together into those mini flows.
Yeah.
So what about the masterclass pilots? How are their heuristics different?
Well, they keep refining their heuristics to an even higher degree. They're incredibly good at sifting through information, recognizing patterns, and focusing their attention on what really matters.
Yeah.
Their heuristics aren't just more numerous.
Okay.
They're also more nuanced, more flexible,
Interesting.
and they can adapt them on the fly when they encounter a new situation.
Right, because they have that deep understanding of the system. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the novice pilot struggling with information overload,
Right.
the proficient pilot who's operating on autopilot, and the masterclass pilot who is constantly seeking a deeper understanding. So what are the key takeaways here? How can we apply this to our own lives?
I think the big thing is that it's a journey, right?
Yeah.
It starts with that effortful discovery as a novice.
Okay.
Then you move towards that efficiency and automation as you become proficient.
Right.
And then for those who choose to pursue it, you reach that masterclass level where you're constantly striving for deeper understanding.
And I really want you, the listener, to think about which of these stages you're currently in different areas of your life.
Right. Like, are there some areas where you're still a novice, others where you're comfortably proficient, and maybe even some where you're approaching that masterclass level?
Exactly. And even more important, what would happen if you consciously adopted that masterclass mindset in those areas where you're currently on autopilot?
Yeah.
What new skills and understandings could you unlock?
What would that look like?
Right. What would it look like to push beyond that comfort zone and really strive for mastery? So here's a challenge for you. Think about the most routine tasks in your life, the things you do almost without thinking. What if those tasks actually hold hidden depths of knowledge and potential for mastery? I bet you could find at least one task, something you do regularly, and in the next few days, try observing it with a fresh perspective, a more critical eye.
Almost like you're seeing it for the first time.
Exactly. You might just be surprised by what you discover.